Beach Burial is an elegiac poem that explores collective and individual experiences of war. Kenneth Slessor encompasses his own experiences as a war correspondent in El-Alamein, allowing him to effectively display the suffering of war through the depiction of an aftermath of a conflict. Slessor utilized this poem to reveal the inconsistencies and paradoxes within human behavior while also provoking the reader to reflect on the motivations of war and to consider the futility of war and the inevitability of death through its somber tone and violent imagery. The imagery within the poem causes the audience to visualize the collective and individual experiences of war and death. In stanza 4, the simile "as blue as drowned man's lips" attempts to shock the audience by the soldier's appearance by producing a graphic image presenting the rawness of the war zone and death in its worst state. This challenges the notion that dying for one's country is as desirable as it ought to be. In stanza 2, the poem is focused on an unknown figure burying the bodies of those fallen on the beach. The line of "someone it seems has time for this" conveys Slusser's frustration with society and war, strengthened by his own experience as a war correspondent watching the suffering. This scene forces the reader to reconsider motivations for war. While in the violence of war, an unknown man takes the time to pluck them from the shells and bury them in burrows. This challenges our understanding of self-interest as the man risks his life to bury the unknown soldier. The quick and forceful nature of pluck and the crude burial of the soldier in burrows creates a harsher tone, highlighting the abnormality of the situation. In stanza 2, Slessor uses onomatopoeia to reinforce the imagery of violence and the melancholy tone of the poem. The personification between the sob and the clubbing of the gunfire is the only time Slessor mentions violence directly. It suggests that violence and war do not stop for the sadness and suffering that is a result of it. Sadness and violence are juxtaposed in this line as to provide an effective imagery on violence in war. Sob refers to the form of the poem itself, reinforcing the elegiac tone, demonstrating the harshness and suffering of war. Slessor also reflects on the spaces between and after a conflict that is paradoxical of a war poem, as it suggests that the loss and destructions is felt more strongly after the conflict rather than during. In recreating a scene of war using sounds and rhythm, the futility of war and the great loss of life can be conveyed effectively. In stanza 1, the long vowel sounds creates an image of the soldiers coming in with the waves. At night they sway and wander in the waters far under. The harsh sounds of the soot and the dirt in the lines "convoys of dead soldiers come" signifies the painful image of the dead soldiers, and the repetition of the what and the dirt evokes the sense of the tides lapping on the beach, immersing the responder in a sense of space. This imagery of sorrows and stillness creates a place for the reader to reflect on the loss of life and the collective experience of the futility of war. In the last stanza, Slessor changes the language and the rhythm by changing to a more subject-oriented style with varying lengths of sentences. He writes with a more speech-like style, altering the narrative voice, giving it more authority. Compare "dead seamen gone in search of the same landfall" and the sharp-clipped rhythm of "enlisted on the other front." This forces the reader to reflect on the direct commentary on the futility of war and the loss of life that is a result. Slessor uses color symbolism to strengthen the sense of loss and the suffering of war. The club blue is used to represent sadness, and purple is associated with the Catholic Church, symbolizing holiness and reverence for the dead. In the simile "as blue as drowned man's lips," the color blue is used to depict the individual suffering of soldiers during war. The symbolism of purple is seen in the metaphor "wavers and fades, the purple drips." It is used to display that the water that is used to symbolize the relentless nature of time and death will eventually erode all the memories of the men who fought in war. This also highlights the dehumanization of war and accentuates an anomaly. After we die, we all have a way to be remembered, but these soldiers will not, which reinforces the strong sense of loss in the poem. The symbolism and emotive language is utilized to challenge our understanding of conflict that allows us to consider the futility of war and the suffering of the soldiers. Beach Burial presents several paradoxes and anomalies when analyzing human behavior. The title of the poem itself is a paradox, as the beach is generally supposed to be a place of life, leisure, and pleasure. However, this is juxtaposed with burial and completely diverts from its meaning by insinuating a somber and melancholy tone. A significant anomaly that is present in the poem is how the soldiers are buried nameless, known as the unknown seamen. The soldiers who fought were stripped of their identity, dehumanized through war, and were given makeshift burials that would be eroded away and essentially forgotten. This invites the reader to consider the futility of conflict that costs human lives. Out of Time is a poem depicting time to be an elemental and existential crisis. Slessor explores the universality of human fear about the inability to slow or prevent the passage of time, and the confronting recognition that existence will end in death, as well as how one perceives time in accordance to their context and circumstances. Slessor utilizes a variety of literary ideas, motifs, and devices, weaving from the abstract metaphors to natural imagery to effectively convey the ceaseless flow of time. Slessor also tries to capture the paradoxical feeling of eternity and immortality in the moment. The structure of the poem conveys the issues of time effectively. The Shakespearean structure of 3 sonnets, each sonnet having 14 lines with 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet, with each line using iambic pentameter that is 10 syllables per line, and the strict rhyming pattern helps to construct a consistent, gentle, and rhythmic flow throughout the poem. The repetition of rhymes in the poem constructs a distinct rhythm. Slessor repeats the rhythm and rhyme in Dark and Light Mouse and His Mistress Might Million, used to create a calming mood that allows the audience to feel as though the poem is not rushing forward, providing a moment of return. The repetition of ly entirely continuously stupidly reinforces the moment of time, as time itself is ignorant of its effects Slessor also repeats less than the E sounds in fleshless and ageless, changeless, and made free, telling the words and their underlying concepts, that of which Slessor utilizes to suggest the ability of moment to liberate the persona from time and grant the persona, the reader, and consequently humanity, a fleeting but true sense of immortality. Each sonnet can be read separately, but are all linked by the last line of the rhyming couplet to express the human experience of running out of time. Each sonnet explores a specific issue, and each quadrant examines an aspect of the broader issue. Slessor attempts to explore the possibilities of the mind in a timeless state beyond the destructive forces of change. Slessor attempts to isolate and freeze a moment of time in order to contemplate its loneliness, however fails. In Sonnet 2, time is personified as a remorseful male figure eagerly moving to quench and kiss as well as ripen and kill. Time and movement are personified as a way to show the forces of conflict between them. Time is depicted as unrelenting, violent, and destructive through the imagery of the bony knife and take me, drills me, and drive through blood and vein. And the repetition of me highlights the subjective and negative experience of time, emphasizing Slessor's idea that time is what wears our physical bodies down. Slessor presents the moment as an opposing force to time. The persona in the poem finds comfort in the moment, saying, I in the moment laugh, and leaning against his golden undertow. Time's violent description is juxtaposed with the moment's warm imagery as this evokes growth and life. The reader is presented with tonal differences and a break from the clear representation of death through the haunting imagery of pale and faceless host and funeral to be ghost. At the beginning of the stanza, the personification of time and the moment are used to show a paradox that challenges our assumptions of time being experienced by humans as a constant. The imagery and personification in this poem explores the inevitability of death. The heart is personified and used as a symbol, crying, Fool, would you leave this country, showing Slessor's way of exploring the human desires of wanting to be unaffected by the ravages of time and death. In the last rhyming couplet, Slessor repeats the simile, and time flows past them like 100 yachts, that is used to begin the poem, forcing the reader back to the harsh reality that time is unrelenting, and while moments may offer brief relief, we will always realize that the body dies and rots, but as a collective of all human experience of death, which evokes anxiety in the reader as the inevitability of time brings us closer to death. Slessor utilized these techniques with the natural imagery of water and light to effectively convey the ceaseless flow of time. In Sonnet 3, the rip analogy reinforces the water imagery within the poem. Slessor's use of imagery and personification helps the reader connect with the complex ideas that are being explored, such as what Slessor once described as the cold fact of time. Slessor does not directly distinguish the motivations of human behavior within and out of time. The poem does, however, infer throughout possible motivations for human behavior in accordance to our fear of running out of time. In Quadrant 2 of Sonnet 2, Slessor uses high modality language of he must open doors to show the inevitability of time moving. In the next line, or close them, for that pale and faceless host, inferring that the end of life is inevitable, allowing us to explore our own motivation in life. Out of Time challenges the reader to evaluate their own motivation in life when faced with the inevitability of death. Markus Zusak's novel The Book Thief is a story set in Nazi Germany during World War II, told through the narration of death. The novel clearly shows the motivations that drive human behavior and the inconsistencies of certain people's behavior in accordance to what is perceived as acceptable. The use of techniques displays the connection between human experience and motivation, evoking emotions that challenges our understanding of how the world works and the beauty and brutality of humanity. Markus Zusak tells the story through the third-person omniscient narration of death. Death is an effective narrator by introducing unique descriptions and definitions of colors, in which he uses to engage the reader to the events occurring in the book. Colors are used to describe his job as a soul gatherer and his connection with people. Death says, a color will be perched on my shoulder and I will gently carry you away. He uses color to recollect on events, trauma, and his own personal feelings. Color helps describe Death's own experience during World War II, providing Death with a human-like image as he expresses emotions when gathering souls. When Death says, far away, fires were burning, I had just picked up 200 murdered souls, compassion is conveyed to the Jews being murdered. Death's experience is how his inner feelings are revealed and how he is connected to Lisa Lemon, meeting her on his way to gather more souls. The use of color is used to illustrate the individual and collective suffering and pain seen throughout the book's setting. For example, Death says, the day was grey, the color of Europe. For me, the sky was the color of Jews. This effectively shows Death's relating colors to the events taking place as a way to give a perspective on the agony and hardships that were endured while living during World War II. Death also provides humorous, informative, and darker sides to engage with the audience and tends to skip along the timeline, revealing events that haven't occurred, then apologizes for giving parts of the story away. Death often comments on our perception of him, correcting us and confronting our understanding of death as is inconsistent with our characterization of death being cruel, disturbing, and horrifying. He reveals himself to be quite human-like by talking directly to the reader. He says, I do not carry a sickle or a scythe, I only wear a hooded black robe when it's cold. I don't have those skull-like features when you seem to enjoy pointing out on me from a distance. You want to know what I truly look like, I'll help you out. Find yourself a mirror while I continue. Death is also depicted of having great fascination with humans, however struggles to understand the beauty and brutality of humans. Death states, I'm always finding humans at the best and worst. I see the ugly and their beauty, and I wonder how the same thing can be both. Zusak makes Death resemble humans and is an effective narrator when viewing human experiences. Throughout the book Thief, we can understand the connection between the character's experience and their motivations and how these may be inconsistent with what is acceptable. The kindness and cruelty of humans is a major theme in the novel that clearly shows the motivations of human behavior. There are several examples of both kindness and cruelty. One major example of an act of kindness is how the Hubermans hiding care from Maxim by doing so placed him at great risk, yet they continue to treat him with the utmost respect, essentially making him a part of their family. Hans' responsibility for living for the dead is shown as Hans is driven by a past promise to a man that indirectly saved his life during World War I to shelter his Jewish son from the Nazis. Hans feels responsible for caring for Eric's family and is the reason why Max is allowed a place in their basement. Max also feels responsible for living for the dead as he is consumed by guilt over leaving his family. Fear is also seen as a motivator in these examples, as this behavior was very Nazi Germany given the political context of the time, with hatred and violence against Jews being rampant. Since 1933, 90% of Germans showed unflinching support for Adolf Hitler. The punishments for aiding a Jew impose fear onto the Huberman family and cause them to act as though they do in their everyday lives to avoid suspicion. There are several motivations that drive human behavior, whether it is fear, love, or anger. It is usually created as a result of past experience. The novel provokes the reader to question human nature and the motivations behind our behavior. The novel challenges how we as humans enjoy bringing about so much distraction. An example of this can be seen as Rudy and his siblings play with their dominoes. Together they would watch everything that was so carefully planned collapse, and they would all smile at the beauty of destruction. This evokes and ignites emotions and thought as to how the world works and the beauty and brutality of humanity. The reader is left to think as why we enjoy watching things such as a house of cards being destroyed. The novel also makes us reflect on history through a perspective one may not have considered, as this representation of Nazi Germany is written through the narration of death and follows a family that is known to have opposing views to the rest of Germany. Markus Zusak often uses rhetorical questions throughout the novel that causes the reader to formulate their own response. An example of this is shown as he writes, "Is there cowardice in the acknowledgement of fear? Is there cowardice in being glad that you live?" The book Thief by Markus Zusak is one that provokes the reader to challenge their understanding of how the world used to work and how it works now.